And I should say that I'm absolutely delighted and nervous to be with these two men, because these guys, if you want to talk about 17th century and military history in the 17th century, they're really the guys to talk to. Micheál wrote the Dictionary of Irish Biography entry on Eoghan Rua Ó Néill. That I think the hard copies are out in the main library, but you can look at them online, dib.ie, and they're all there, and it's wonderful work that's there. Pádraig's your survey of the 17th century, Consolidating Conquest, I always use that whenever I'm teaching 17th century Ireland. Well, it's a great book, and so I'm delighted to have them here today. So really I'm just going to nudge them along and let their expertise lead the way in what we're talking about today. So I suppose when we think about his early life, and he's an Ulster man, and can you, Micheál, just quickly run us through his family background, his Cavan connections as the stand and so on?
Yeah, certainly, and again, thanks for the invite to come here this morning. I'm actually delighted to be here. It's a strange thing, we're talking about history and legacy and whatever. One of the early memories I have of Irish history is a small book that my grandfather gave me about Eoghan Rua Ó Néill. I remember as a youngster being really sort of taken by this sort of great hero, this man who won this great victory at Benburb, and sort of, he was one of those figures that really stood out for me. So when I became a historian itself, it was a great joy to sort of actually get into this in some kind of detail. And oftentimes your heroes don't sometimes live up to your expectations when you actually go and look at them in a little bit more detail. But Eoghan Rua's life does actually stand up to closer scrutiny. He was an extraordinary man in many ways, and his achievements really are, in the sort of context in which he was operating, were quite extraordinary. So I think it's very appropriate that he should be sort of remembered at this weekend, and as I say, congratulations to everybody for putting together such an interesting programme. But to answer the immediate question about his background yourselves, Eoghan Rua Ó Néill really was of a huge sort of importance in terms of his lineage. He's of that O'Neill family, the ruling O'Neill family. He's a nephew, of course, of the great Hugh O'Neill, 2nd Earl of Tyrone. And therefore he's very much in that sort of central sort of ruling grouping of the O'Neills. I think, as it was mentioned, Emma, so we're not 100% sure about who his mother was. It's almost probably most likely that she was an O'Reilly, and given where we are, I'm just going to say she was an O'Reilly. We'll just take it that she was a Cavan woman, so that we can confirm that kind of connection. But again, all the sort of leading families he's linked into, whether it's the O'Donnells, the Maguires, the O'Reillys, these were sort of the leading families of Ulster, and all very much closely interrelated. Rivals at times, but also working together at different times as well. So in a way, we shouldn't be surprised that Eoghan Rua sort of emerges at this time as a figure of some significance, given the sort of importance of his lineage and these connections among the leading Ulster families.
Yeah, right. He's born around 1580 or so-ish. I suppose we could try a DNA test and see whether we can find someone who's connected to him. But he was born around around 1580 or so he would have been probably teen when the 9 Years' War is going on. So I was just wondering, Pádraig, could you talk us through a wee bit of what's going on in the 9 Years' War, what life would have been like around that time, or the immediate aftermath, after 1603?
And the date of birth, I'm thinking about this one, 1580. If he was 1580, you would imagine he should have been more centrally involved in the 9 Years' War. I mean, you don't hear a peep about him. On the other hand, what was his father, Micheál was on the outs with Hugh, wasn't he, at various stages, and he was siding with the English. So it's maybe a part of the story that falls between the cracks. So what's happening? The war is over, Treaty of Lenihan, 1603. The English apparently on the face of it won the war but lost the peace. Lenihan is a very good deal for the Great O'Neill. However, it is not observed, and thereafter, in the years after, the situation for the surviving Irish, it becomes pretty difficult, or at any rate, with the infamous flight of the Earls. Hugh O'Neill, the Great O'Neill, leaves Ireland forever, as it turns out. That's 1607. By that stage, our friend Eoghan Rua has left. He went in 1605. Why has he gone? His father, Art, had a plantation of 2,000 acres, 2,000 acres, excuse me, in O'Néill land. That's in the northeastern part of County Antrim. However, that was only a life interest, and he lost that on his death. So the sons are not provided for. Brian, his son, MacArt, Eoghan Rua's brother, is executed in 1607 for, I think, complicity in the flight. Basically, the authorities in Dublin Castle tried to spread the blame for complicity in this flight as widely as possible. So he's not leaving a great deal behind him. He goes in 1605 and becomes a captain in the regiment of Henry O'Neill, which lends credence to the fact that he's a man of relatively mature years. If this 1580 birth date, and now at 1605 he's going to Flanders, he's around 25, that is about the age at which you'd expect somebody would be made a captain. Younger than that happens, but it's unusual. So he's a captain in the regiment from 16. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
No.
But he's leaving behind him, to answer Brendan's question, he's leaving behind him an Ireland that is, I mean, however much you might try and overlook the importance of the flight of the Irish, as it's like the Cromwellian conquest. It's one of these discontinuities. It's abrupt, it's violent, and it's followed by the plantation of Ulster. It opens the way for the plantation of Ulster because the lands of the people who fled, or even those who didn't flee, who were found to be complicit in the flight, are declared confiscate. So 6 counties, including Cavan, are up for grabs. When the plantation happens, of all of the counties, Cavan emerges best in the sense that the existing landowners in Cavan and Monaghan, which is kind of, in Cavan, they do best. Probably the worst of all is Donegal, where the existing landowners do worst of all. And that's the polarity. But what is plantation? It is not just about taking land from the landowners, it is about a wholesale transformation of society, replacing everybody over most of the undertakers, over most of those 6 counties, from Hewer of Wood and Drawer of Water, right up to landowner. So he's leaving an Ulster particularly that's in, from his point of view, ruins.
I think that, if I may just say,
jump in at any time.
the key point I think that Pádraig is making, I think is a very important one for Eoghan's subsequent career when he returns to Ireland, is that, they've lost out. Here's a family that, had lands, had great sort of power and authority, and they've lost out. So one of the reasons when he's returning is this great suspicion of Eoghan Rua that he's coming back to try and recover what has been lost, to overturn the plantation settlement, to sort of recreate Gaelic Ireland and the power that these families had. And that creates a huge tension between those who actually have done okay out of the settlement, or are still holding on to whatever lands they had, and those who've lost everything, most of whom end up on the continent, and Eoghan Rua is one of these. But going back to the point, and I did write the entry, but I have to say I now am questioning this 1580 date of his birth. I think it was a few years later, because the silence of his activities during the 9 Years' War to me are problematic. If this man was in his late teens, early 20s, as prominent as he was, he would have appeared somewhere in the records doing something, and yet there's hardly a mention of him at all. And to me that is problematic, and it probably suggests that maybe he's a bit younger than we had thought, and it could well be that he was born 1685-86, in which case he would have been a young teenager during all of this, which might explain the absence in the records. Now we don't know and we'll never be sure, but the more I've been reflecting on it, the less convinced I am that a man of his maturity, in his early 20s, while the war was still going on, that we'd hear nothing of his activities. It just seems a bit odd to me, Pádraig, I have to say. So I think I'm questioning my own date that I had put in, like 1580. I suspect it's probably a few years later, and that he's younger. And even still, as Pádraig's saying, when he left in 1605, even if he was born in 1585, he would have been 20, which was, an adult, certainly of that period. There's no problem with that dating. So it does suggest to me that maybe we need to push back the date a little bit in terms of his birth.
when we talk, Pádraig, about his military career on the continent, who's he going to fight for? What's happening on the continent that that there's work for him, as it were, there?
The Spanish are the American. That's the US of the 17th century. They're the superpower. They are fueled. Their operations are fueled by a stream of silver from Bolivia, South America. They are fighting to retain what is now Belgium, and the Spanish Netherlands, as it then was, and to reconquer what is now the Netherlands, which had originally been theirs. That war is called the 80 Years' War, because it goes on for 80 years. Because it doesn't end until 1648, with a brief pause, in a brief pause from I think 1609. So that's the war that's going on. It's a grindingly slow conquest. If you look at, there's nobody here from Holland or Belgium, I can say that. I mean, Belgium makes geographically, culturally, historically, no sense whatsoever. It's where the two parties stopped fighting in 1648. If you look at Belgium, there's a little bit that sticks down to, follows the Rhine down to Maastricht. And there's another bit, there's no linguistic sense, there's southern Holland is largely Catholic, the Netherlands, northern Belgium is Dutch speaking, it doesn't make any sense. That's the legacy of that war. It's a war of sieges. There's only one battle, Newport, in 1601. Otherwise, it's sieges, gaining, holding places, losing them, and it grinds on. Does that answer your question about the nature of the warfare that is? Oh yes, and in that, the Spanish army is bringing in, it has the Spanish army, you've got the Iberia, so you've got Portugal, Spain, Castile, most of Italy, the Milanese, and Naples and Sicily. So you've got most of what's now Italy, Spain, and other contingents. The Walloons, the Irish are part of that. So there's an Irish regiment, and in the 1630s, 2 Irish regiments embodied fighting for the Spanish during that time. By 1640, the period we're looking at, those regiments had been so knocked about by disease, by action, so the wastage, that they are, in fact, there is John O'Neill's, the son of the Tyrone's regiment gone to Spain, you've Preston's is practically nothing, and Eoghan Rua's regiment by this stage is reduced to officers, a very few men. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and they're fighting the French, is it?
Sorry, who are they fighting against? They're fighting the Dutch, mainly. But then the French, then that 80 Years' War gets caught up in the 30 Years' War, which involves the German, it sucks in everybody. It begins with a revolt by Bohemian or Czech rebels against the Habsburgs. Then a German Protestant alliance is formed. Then the German Catholic alliance is formed. That pulls in the Dutch. That pulls in the Swedes. Then the French are pulled in. The French, oddly enough, or not at all oddly enough, come in on the so-called Protestant side. There's one constant about European warfare in the 17th and most of the 18th century. The Habsburgs are always fighting against the Bourbons. That's it. Everything else underlies that. So the French always are fighting against the Habsburgs and vice versa. So the French come in on the side. So to answer your question, who is O'Neill fighting against? He's fighting laterally, initially against the Dutch, and he sees action at Rheinberg. He sees action at Arras against the French, 1640, there is best known. And of course, Breda, 1624-25, against the Dutch. So those are the people he's fighting against.
Well, the point is, what's more consistent even than what Pádraig is saying, is that in the 17th century, there's only 3 years, calendar years, where there isn't a major war being fought on the continent of Europe. So this is a continent and a time of war. And if you're a young man with no prospects at home, no possibility of saying, well, where do you go? You go to the continent to make yourself a career in the army. And so Eoghan Rua and thousands of Irishmen like him head off to fight in the different armies on the continent of Europe in order to make a career for themselves. These are career soldiers. This is their opportunity to make a living for themselves and hopefully to make a name for themselves as well. So you get huge numbers heading over into this cauldron of war, and there's war all over the place. I'm delighted to hear Pádraig trying to explain the 80 Years' War and the 30 Years' War in about 2 minutes. They're very complex wars, and we really won't get into it here because it's just far too complicated to get into. But the point simply is that there's just constant warfare. So there are opportunities, and that's what Eoghan Rua sees. He's looking for an opportunity. The sort of homeland is closed off to him in terms of what he can do. So where does he go? Well, there's now a fairly well-trodden path. They're heading off to Europe, where there's always war and there's always opportunity.
And to pick up on what the point you're making about, it's at one level it's a professional choice. It's what, these guys are swords for hire, and yet they're not. There's more to it than that. There is a certain ideology. If you're a Scottish Presbyterian, and they go in their tens of thousands, because Ireland, like Scotland, like Switzerland, areas that are of marginal agricultural areas, they produce excess manpower. That's what they do. So you'll find a disproportionate number of the soldiers in these wars are coming from places like Croatia, Switzerland, Highland zones, generally speaking, Ireland, Scotland in particular. But the Scots go to Sweden, and to a lesser extent to Poland, and for the Irish go to Spain, the Catholic Irish. There's some sort of crossover, but by and large, they're soldiers for hire, but they are going where they're wanted, where they are religiously, where in terms of ideology or religion, they're welcomed and trusted and accepted. So there is ideology and the lure of careers.
But also, sorry Brendan, I keep jumping in, but just to point out, one of the things they like these soldiers, particularly from the Highlands of Scotland or Croatia or Finland as well, they're terrified of the Finns, and the Irish, is that these are hardy people. They're able to survive on not very much, and so they're very valued as soldiers because they are actually able to campaign in difficult conditions. They're able to survive on not very much in terms of supplies, etc. And they've got a reputation of being fierce fighters. So they're very prized assets to have. And the Spanish are very keen to get Irish soldiers because of this reputation. Because now, as Pádraig's saying, they're also seen as religiously supportive because they're also Catholics. So therefore the Spanish are quite happy to have them. Whereas for the Swedes, they're looking for Protestant soldiers, therefore they're more likely to go to Scotland. But these people from the peripheries of Europe are really prized assets at this time, because they're hardy soldiers, they're tough fighters, and they're seen as a huge bonus to the European armies at this time. So they're quite sought after.
And then it's not just war that's going on. He finds time for love and he marries. The woman he marries, she's an extraordinary woman. Yeah. I mean, really, there should be more done about her. She's an incredible woman. You can just tell us a wee bit about her.
Yeah, Rose O'Doherty, who's, they say behind every man there's a great woman. Well, certainly in Eoghan Rua's case, that's absolutely true. She's really quite an extraordinary person who oftentimes is keeping the show on the road while, he, behind the scenes, she's the one who's making the contacts, who's organising stuff. I mean, she's really an extraordinary individual. And without getting too sort of soppy about it, it does seem to be a genuine love match. They were very, very close. And they stayed together throughout their lives, and staying with Eoghan Rua Ó Néill really was a labour of love because this man was moving around a lot, he was living in difficult conditions, and staying with that was no easy task. And she does that right up until the very end. In fact, she arrives at Clopúta Castle just a day or two after Eoghan Rua's death. She's summoned to say that he's dying and just misses it, unfortunately, arrives just after his death. So they stay together throughout this extraordinary period. And again, she is connected to the O'Dohertys of the Inishowen Peninsula. She was married to an O'Donnell, so she's very well connected herself. So again, this is showing these interconnections between all these families in Ulster and the importance of this in terms of binding them together, of forming these alliances that stand them in such good stead throughout their military and political careers. And again, to be kind of blunt about it, Rosa is a big asset to Eoghan Rua in his life and career.
And she's on the boat. She goes with the flight of the Irish.
She does, and she ends up in Rome and doesn't like Rome. In fact, none of them like Rome. Rome is lethal at this stage. It kills most of them. They die of fevers, etc. It's a death sentence always in some ways for them. And she asks for permission to go to Flanders and is refused. But by the time the refusal arrives, she's already left. She wasn't going to wait around for the approval. It's already gone. So she makes her own way to Flanders, to the large Irish community in Flanders at this time, and it's there that Eoghan Rua meets her, I think in about 1612, 1613, and they get married very shortly afterwards.
And certainly there's one son, Henry, who kind of follows the footsteps and fights as well.
There is. She had a son from an earlier marriage to an O'Donnell who also joined with Eoghan Rua Ó Néill. That stepson is killed at the Siege of Breda in 1625, but they have a son themselves through their own marriage, Henry, who forms a very close partnership with his father and is very active when they return in the 1640s, right through to his own death, following the Battle of Scarlett-Hollis in 1650.
Pádraig, there's talk around 1625, Eoghan Rua has an eye back home again, and there's talk about maybe trying to plan an invasion of Ireland. He goes to the Spanish looking for help, but it doesn't really work out.
Yeah, I would, in answer, I'd nearly defer to Micheál on that one. You probably know it's a very issue of Micheál. It's one of these many conspiracies. But what the standout point to me from this is, what did Eoghan Rua want? What was he looking for at this point? His views, although he moderates them when he's back in Ireland in the 1640s, he is advocating some form of republic. Am I right? Or am I talking from my head?
No, they use the word, it's an interesting one. No, you're absolutely right. They use the word republic. I think there's many reasons for that. It might not be quite a republic the way we would understand it. It's a form of government where, a form of self-government very closely aligned with the Spanish, etc. I mean, there are republics in Europe this time, the Dutch Republic, obviously the Venetian Republic, there are republics, but, as I said, maybe not how we understand them in the 21st century. But I think what they were looking for from the Spanish at this time was the O'Neills and the O'Donnells were saying England and Spain had fallen out, a war had started between them, and they said, listen, we can get involved here, we can help you by causing trouble for the English in Ireland, and if you support us and finance our regiments to return home, we can hopefully take the country, etc., etc. So it was part of a broader, shall we say, strategic planning that was going around the English-Spanish war at this time. But as so often happened, and as Pádraig's absolutely right, you could spend your life about these conspiracies, these plans, most of whom came to nothing at all, unfortunately. And this is another example of stuff that they were, for a year or two, it looked like there might be something going on. The Spanish king was suggesting he might help, but ultimately, it just came to nothing.
What happened was, it was something Micheál said, you get me reminded. The English contrived, and somehow their diplomacy was so bad that this is under James and then perpetuated by Charles. They managed to fall out and go to war with France and Spain at almost the same time. That's like I don't know, if you're going to think, that's like Italy managing to go to war with the United States and Russia at the same time. Am I right? It's inconceivable. You managed to go fighting this. So in that sort of strange circumstance, Eoghan Rua thought he could fish in those troubles.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
So he stays on the continent anyway for the next 15 odd years or more, and the big thing in the continent is, and I think you mentioned earlier, is Aris.
I actually went to Wikipedia and pressed this little thing that you can see how it is pronounced. It's Ara.
Oh, even better. All right, so the S side. So I mean that's like the big siege that he's in charge of there, and even though they'll lose the siege, I suppose he comes out of it with honour intact and.
Well, I mean, he's fighting a rear. Again, in 1640, the Spanish Empire looks like it is collapsing, and it's going to get worse. And part of that, they're going to be facing revolts in Naples, Portugal, Catalonia. They're also facing a joint attack by the French from the south and the Dutch from the north on the Spanish Netherlands, on Belgium. And part of that, Arras is in what is now northern France, was then part of Belgium, and after in the territorial, if you like, nibbling away at Spanish territories, the Spanish lost that territory afterwards. So he's fighting a very creditable rearguard action with a garrison of 2,000 men against a besieging army of something like 30, in excess of 30,000, and there's also a covering army. So he's way outnumbered, and he doesn't hold it, but he fights an aggressive campaign. Why? Okay, so he's a loser. He loses, but he loses what the Spanish are playing for is time. So if you're a governor who's keeping someone like Arras for a couple of months, that's tying up the entire French army for that summer. Armies only fight in the summer, so you've gained a year. That's another year that you can get your taxes together, you can recruit, and you can respond. That's why these wars, it goes on for 80 years, because it's very hard to strike the decisive blow. The other side, you're losing time the whole time. It's a grinding and slow conquest. So yeah, he makes his reputation at that stage. In the same way that Preston, to be fair to him, his great rival Thomas Preston, who would become general of the Leinster Army, and there's a personal niv, we might call it, a rivalry between him and O'Neill. Preston made his name defending Louvain in 1635 against, I think, the Dutch coming from the north, and they actually stopped that. They defended it successfully. So those are the sort of actions. Why is that important? Because a lot of the lessons that O'Neill learns in this kind of warfare, and that Preston learns in this kind of warfare, is simply not applicable to Ireland. When he comes back to Ireland in 1641, he has to forget a lot of stuff he knows, a lot of his expectations, and really learn warfare. So Eoghan Rua is not a battlefield commander. For all his experience and I was talking about to Micheál about this last night. What is he? He is what's called a sergeant major. Now that we think of a sergeant major as being the best way it's now majors. So if you can imagine, a colonel is in charge of a regiment. Assisting him is a major. The major is typically, the colonel is a man of wealth who owns the regiment or recruits it, who's there because of his eminence. The major in a regiment is the experienced person who actually knows what he's doing. So he looks after discipline, training. Whereas the colonel probably doesn't know what he's doing. The major is the key officer there. So he has been a major. It's a senior appointment in a regiment. I think latterly he's a Maestro de Campo, which is a brigadier, which is rather higher. But when he comes back to Ireland, he has great experience in some respects. But that experience is not necessarily entirely relevant to the Irish context.
And we come up then to 1641. And Micheál, you're a man who knows a lot about 1641. Anyone who's looked at the depositions online, the 1641 depositions, Micheál was one of the principal investigators in that project. Can you just run through what's going on in Ireland in 1641 and what kind of precipitates his return?
Similar you than me.
Yeah, well, again, there's a series of plots and conspiracies going on around Ireland 1641, tied in with broader issues that are going on in England and Scotland at the same time as well. But one of the key elements in this are the exiled Irish, and Eoghan Rua in particular, who's encouraging his compatriots in Ulster to consider armed rebellion. And I think he's very conscious himself. His life is, sort of moving on. He's now, by the standards of the 17th century, an elderly man. And if he's going to get home, he needs to get home now. He can't wait a few more years, etc. So when he hears that there is sort of, plans afoot in Ulster, he's very, very supportive and says, yeah, go for it. And if you rebel, I will come home and support you. So anytime they send emissaries, as they do, over to Eoghan Rua in Flanders, he is very, very encouraging of them to go into rebellion. So when they finally do rebel in October 1641, and again, it's Sir Phelim O'Neill, the O'Neill family are very central to this once again. Eoghan Rua is delighted when he hears word of this and is very supportive as well. But he's not there. He's not there. And in the first 4 or 5 months of the rebellion, after an initial kind of success of a few weeks, things begin to go very badly wrong for the rebels. The government forces begin to recover and to push them back, and it looks like as if the whole thing is going to fall apart and come to a very premature end. And in fact, they come together to discuss that very prospect and say, look, this isn't working, we're going to have to flee, the rebellion has failed, it's all over, we're going to have to flee to the continent and leave. And in one of those very great dramatic moments, as they're sitting around discussing that, a messenger arrives in to say, Eoghan Rua has returned from the continent. Now, I think we can't, overestimate the impact this has. It's like an electric shock coming through. This is a man, not only in Irish circles, but now in European circles, is of renown. He is a figure of note. After the siege of Arras, and I'll accept the pronunciation of Pádraig, I don't know, it's a very honourable defeat, but word of this spreads around Europe. Eoghan Rua is a name that has now been talked about as somebody who's behaved very honourably, done very well. So he's a man of note. And suddenly, out of the blue, and it is out of the blue, he flees Flanders. He doesn't have permission to go. He simply slips away quietly with a couple of hundred soldiers of his own, and they suddenly arrive up in Castle in Donegal. And I said it is transformative, because suddenly the Ulster rebels, from being in a position saying it's all over, we're going to have to flee, the thing is over, suddenly Eoghan Rua's back, and now everything has changed because their leader has returned. It's amazing. 35 years after the flight of the Earls, the O'Neills are back. And they're back led by this great hero, this great military figure of European renown, and suddenly the whole sort of tenor of the rebellion, the whole atmosphere around it has changed utterly. And instead of a 12 years war which lasts from 1641 to 53, this could have been over after a few months. The reason it persists, the reason it turns into this great war which goes on for 12 years, arguably is because of Eoghan Rua. And if he had not returned, this thing could have collapsed within a matter of months.
And so was then just a tie into that. He's appointed general, I think, of the Ulster forces. And it seems to me that when he comes back, he's not, I think you alluded to it, Pádraig, he's not terribly impressed by the state of play in terms of military, the discipline and so on and so forth. And maybe the supplies he's getting, or the support he's getting, maybe Preston was getting more support than he was in Leinster. And then you have the Battle of Clonus in June 1643, and many Ulster men have left Clonus with their tail between their legs, generally with football in mind rather than the military. But can you just talk through, because whenever we talk about Eoghan Rua, I suppose it's the devil in me, they always talk about Ben Burr, but Clonus is there as well, and not a shining moment for him.
Let's talk about that. Well, first of all, the man, as Micheál said, Phelim O'Neill. Phelim, I have great time for him. I'm a minority. I think he's militarily he's not very good, but he's got charisma. He's a natural conspirator. He pulls this insurrection together. It's remarkably successful. Up to it's secret. They achieve quite a lot, but it is by June 1642. It is in danger of collapsing. So they're under pressure by armies attacking from Antrim and Down, Scottish armies, by the armies of the Lenihan coming from Donegal, from Enniskillen. They're in a sort of a pincer. And here is Eoghan Rua landing, as it were, behind the Lenihan armies, back up there in northwest Donegal, where they still have the western extremities. And Phelim manages, to his credit, to get and lead an expedition from there up to Castle. Very awkward to get there. Bring most of the supplies and the men back down through around the Ballyshannon Gap, through across, I don't know whether to go north or south of Lough Erne, and then make their way back to Charlemont. We've been mentioning Charlemont a lot. Okay, Charlemont is the strategic forward base of the Ulster Army. It is on the River Blackwater, near Benburb as well, as it happens, as about us the nearest town, Moy or Blackwater's town, and it's a very strong fortification. If you can imagine Lough Neagh, it's at the southwestern extremity, near the southwestern extremity of Lough Neagh. That's important to our story. He's obviously a shoo-in. He's made General of Ulster, General of the Ulster Army. Phelim is kicked upstairs. He's now President of Ulster. So he is a territorial command, but Eoghan Rua is in charge of the army. Eoghan Rua promises Phelim he's not going to leave him. He's going to stay and he's going to protect Ulster. Having delivered that promise, Eoghan Rua decides this is not survivable. He has no supplies, he is under pressure. What he decides, he has an encounter with the Scottish army under Munro near Anasamry, near Loughgall in County Armagh. O'Neill's dream, he had plans of establishing himself and a base in O'Neill land, in that part of Armagh. He fights a rearguard action. It's tactically a victory, strategically it's a defeat, because it decides on he cannot survive in Ulster for the moment. So he gathers his followers and the Creaghts. Now we must mention a little bit about the Creaghts, C-R-E-A-G-H-T-S. These are refugees from the other parts of enemy-occupied Ulster, from Antrim, from Down, from Derry, from Donegal, with their cattle. So if you can imagine an entire society travelling with its cattle and whatever they can carry on their backs. And they follow the Ulster Army, or more particularly, the Ulster Army follows them. In other words, their movements are dictated to a great extent by where the Creaghts get their grazing and where they move. So summer or winter, it's a migratory pattern. So they're moving south it's south, and he doesn't do this again. He's moving close near Clonus. He comes under attack unexpectedly by the Lagan army and the Enniskillen army. These are Protestant armies largely raised from settlers in north-west Donegal, which is the most successful plantation area. And he's taken by surprise, and to cut a long story short, he is attacked, and he himself is fighting in the rearguard to facilitate the retreat. But it's a rout, and his army is scattered north, south, east, every direction. And he himself ends up back in South Tyrone, at a place called in Brantry. And I love the way he writes. He writes to the following day in English to Cole, and he says, "Look, or Stuart, he's writing from our camp at Brantry. His camp at Brantry comprised him, his son Henry, 2 or 3 other horsemen. That was it. I mean, that's how badly he was beaten. Does that answer your question?" Yeah, yeah. He then, if you like, how does he manage to re-establish his army? A man called Scarampi, the papal envoy, a predecessor, he comes with a certain amount of money, and that is like, I don't know, the equivalent of giving somebody a diabetic a shot of insulin or something. It's just, he's away again. And he moves into County Meath. Why? Don't look for any strategy as to why he's moving into County Meath, right? He is, I can't see any, he's moving there because it's summertime and the grazing is good, and the Creaghts are there, and the English occupying Moore from Dundalk leads an army to attack him. He has a face-off with him at a place called Port Leicester. Moore is canonised, as the pun goes, by Eoghan Rua points a cannon at Moore, and the cannon kills Moore, so beheads him with it. That is Scorn. O'Neill wins, typically having won insofar as he drove off the enemy. he doesn't follow. The guy said, let's pursue these, let's pursue them. And O'Neill, and he's right, O'Neill knows his limitations, because he says, what needs a rich man be a thief? We've beaten him. Why do we need to pursue them? Because he knows that if he pursues them, it's quite likely he will be beaten. He knows, he learns the limitations of his own people. He learns how to work within those limitations and to practice a cautious Fabian style of warfare. That is his genius, the ability to unlearn and to relearn.
And then I suppose a few years later you mentioned the papal envoy was coming along, then you have Rimachini coming along a few years later, and then how that runs into Ben Burb. Like, is that like another shot in the arm for O'Neill?
Well, there's further supplies come then, but I think what you need to sort of understand about O'Neill, that O'Neill's primary interest throughout this period is to keep his army together. Because as long as he's an army, he's a player. He's got something to offer, he's got possibilities of achieving something. If he throws the dice in battle and loses, that could be it. It could be all done and dusted, over. And he's a supremely cautious man. He doesn't want to do that. So he spends a huge amount of time just simply manoeuvring around, keeping his army together, supplying it, trying to make sure that they don't get caught out again like they did at Clones. He is not prepared to risk everything. And ultimately, when he is brought to battle, Ben Burb is not brought to battle because he really is looking for battle. The other guy is pursuing him. And pursuing him for quite some time and is desperately trying to bring him to battle. He wants to defeat O'Neill and knock him out of the game. And O'Neill is moving around all the time trying to avoid this. And eventually, O'Neill sees an opportunity. Monroe has been pursuing him so hard, his own army is now exhausted. It's on the day of battle, it's the end of the day. They've been moving around all day. They're now attacking into the sunset. They're sort of blinded by the sun. So O'Neill eventually chooses the battle, but at his own time, in his own place, when it is right. And it's, again, this has been 3 years in the making. This is 3 years after Clones, where eventually he decides he's going to give battle, which he does at Ben Burb, and of course wins a absolutely dramatic victory, one of the largest battlefield victories of the Irish, certainly of this war in the mid-17th century, and really that battle that cements his reputation, Brendan, because everybody talk about Eoghan Rua Ó Néill, Ben Burb is what you think about. So again, it's a huge victory, but as Pádraig has pointed out, it doesn't lead to any long-term gain, because again, O'Neill is simply not in the game of pursuing the enemy now and trying to push home the end advantage. He simply sits back. He's won his battlefield victory. Once again, he keeps his forces together, he works out the supplies, he doesn't follow through. So Ben Burb, for all its great achievement on the day, doesn't actually significantly alter the balance of the war.
And is this something, his reluctance to kind of follow on, is this something that you would have learned in Europe? Like it seems a bit conservative, but maybe you're right. Like, you're saying, well, if he'd have followed on, it might have gone worse for him.
Yeah, I mean, before Ben Burb, he's moving from, he's got his farming up area. His area, insofar as he has a base, if you like, where Longford, Cavan and Westmeath meet, Lochsheelan, Finney, that part, that's his base, okay, around about there. So he's marching from there, from the Knockanover or the Hill of Gold, where his troops have been paid, comes through Cavan on the way up to no Clones from this time, straight up through Monaghan, Glasgow, I think, and onto Charlemont. What's going on there? It's entirely predictable. It's summertime. Charlemont is up there. That's where the grazing is. He's got his base up there. So I don't think he has any big strategic plan. What Monroe has, and as Micheál says, Monroe walked, his men marched 20 miles before they even come to battle. They are knackered. They're tired. So he wins that day. Why does he not pursue? He does to a certain extent. He sends raiding parties into Clandeboy and deep into Down. He does try and bring the other part of the converging army, the Lagan army, to battle. They escape. Then he's called back to Kilkenny, capital of the Confederate Catholics. Why? And that's a wider problem that's going on here. And we'll be hearing about that maybe from your lecture later on. The Pope or the Nuncio has a difficulty with a compromise peace that the Confederate Catholic Supreme Council has made with the Protestant Royalist Ormond. He has great difficulties with it. And he recalls Eoghan Rua's army south to give a certain amount of weight to his ecclesiastical censures, as it were, threats of excommunication. So you have an incipient civil war that doesn't happen because the Ormondists are just back down completely at that stage. But Eoghan Rua is drawn deeply into the politics of the other provinces. And in latter years, we see Eoghan Rua being a presence not just in Leinster, Connaught and Ulster, Limerick, North Kerry. He is a national figure. He's peculiarly Cavan, and I think of him as Cavan. This is where he operated mostly. His mother, Hugh Conduct's daughter, probably was. He has close associations, but he is a national figure as well. And I've lost it from my train of. But the question that you put to me, Brendan, was caution. Yeah, he is cautious. But in this situation, I don't think he could have. What following on was he going to do? Even beating Monroe's army, he's still at 6,000 to 7,000 men. He's still at strongholds. Kind of prizing him out of that would have been a very difficult job. Okay.
But just, I think that the point that needs to be made here is, and as people from Cavan, I'm sure you're aware, is that the rest of Ireland saw Ulster as different, very different. And there was quite a lot of hostility towards Ulstermen in the other provinces. They didn't like them, they didn't want them coming south, and they saw them, if you like, as locusts that would come in, these huge bands with their families and all supporting with their cattle, and would kind of eat their way through county after county in a destructive way. So they didn't want the Ulster men and their families outside of Ulster. So they were quite happy for them to be fighting up there and doing the business, but stay up there please, alright? And so anytime O'Neill started to come south, there were problems with it. There was a lot of hostility. And this hostility was something that becomes increasingly a factor in the rebellion in Ireland between the Ulstermen and the rest of the Catholics who are fighting at this particular time. And there's particular rivalries going on involving Eoghan Rua Ó Néill, but there's no need to go into the detail of that. But the other point I think really that needs to be made is that also there's an increasing divergence between those who are in rebellion but are still part of society. They still have something to lose, and those that they see who've come back from the continent and as far as they are concerned have nothing to lose. Yeah. This is it. They're the ones who need to win completely, to overturn in order to get their lands back, in order to have a new type of society. And then those who are saying, well, look, we want as Catholics not to be persecuted, but let's not get too sort of radical here. Let's not overturn everything. So there's a huge growing divergence between these groupings, and a lot of it, if you like, the spark that lights a lot of this has to do with religion and the place of Catholicism. As I obviously we'll be talking much more eloquently about this shortly. But the thing about Eoghan Rua Ó Néill, and I'll just say this about religion, as I won't really venture anymore, but here's a man who's lived most of his life on the continent, in Catholic areas where there is the full splendour of the Catholic Church. This is the norm, this is what people expect. In Ireland, obviously, that is not the case. And a lot of Catholics are saying, listen, we keep it sort of private and we can just, carry on our lives as long as we're not persecuted. And those who are saying, no, we must have the full return of the Catholic Church with all its splendour, public, etc. And so that religious issue further intensifies this growing rift that we can see among the Catholic sort of alliances taking place. And Eoghan Rua Ó Néill finds himself on two grounds, both religiously and both as an Ulsterman, increasingly isolated from his Catholic conspirators or our religious and military allies at this time. And so at the very moment they need to be most united, they find themselves unravelling and beginning to fragment into different groups that ends up ultimately, by 1648, there's a civil war effectively going on with the different Catholic forces fighting one another.
And O'Neill is censored. I mean, he's put outside. We have a thing outside the proclamation where Kilkenny basically, make them like you're an outcast now. You're not one of us now.
And absolutely. So within 2 years of Benburrough, when he's achieved this great victory, and again, everything seems to be going their way. Within 2 years, as you say, Brendan, he's become effectively an outlaw. He is being cast away. They're saying, we don't want anything to do with him. He's far too radical. And he finds himself now under attack, not from English forces or Scottish forces, but from actually Catholic forces who are now beginning to snipe away, and he's having to move around, trying to protect himself from attacks. And this ends up in this bizarre series of alliances where Eoghan Rua Ó Néill now finds himself trying to arrange temporary ceasefires with English parliamentarians, with Scots, with anybody who will provide him with supplies, who will, provide him some kind of protection. So the whole thing falls apart quite disastrously. And by 1648, it's really a mess. And the whole thing has just, fallen apart. And for poor Eoghan Rua, he now finds himself, as I said, an effective outlaw from the Catholic government of Kilkenny and moving around Ireland under attack from all sides. A very difficult situation.
He said it's really a mess. I must try and use that, try and avoid having to explain it. It's a good one. I mean, I didn't explain the geography of it. When we look at Ulster, Cavan, Monaghan, East Tyrone are largely Irish controlled throughout this period. Then you have a large no man's land where there's nobody living. But the rest of it, that's where the Creots are coming from. So you wouldn't, and Micheál are quite right, they are disliked for the reason that they don't pay for their grazing. So if you're a farmer in Leinster and you see thousands of these guys coming in there, it's a problem. So he wins, he's on the winning side in the first showdown, 1646. The second showdown, 1648. The king is going to be executed, Charles. Everybody on the royalist side, nearly everybody, there's a complete reshuffling. That's why I sympathise with you. How do you explain that? It's so complicated. But basically, you have a reshuffling of allegiances, that wars, and Eoghan Rua is the backing the clericalist side. He is operating. What's the decisive? Is there any? Let's try and picture what happens. He controls the Midlands from all the way from various stages, from Limerick, North Tipperary, Laois, Offaly, Kildare, Athy, for example. He's got garrisons at various places in the Midlands. And strategically, Preston from Leinster, Siochrú from Munster, Clanrickard in his fumbling way from Connacht, all converge on him. He manages to defeat them tactically every single time. He manages to outwit them, strategic retreats, but ultimately he's pushed north to Ulster. And we don't want to talk about, because it's inconvenient history, the fact that he allied for a while with Cromwell's party, with Monk, and that he relieved the siege of Derry. Derry was besieged in 1649 by a royalist alliance. Inside was the notorious Charles Booth the Younger. Who was the man who broke up the royalist siege? Eoghan Rua with his army. Okay, let's never speak of that again. Okay, I've mentioned it, but it doesn't make any political, wider, strategic sense, except, as you rightly say, he gets power, he gets money, he survives for another day. But that's sorry, I went there. You're right, probably to say it's a mess and leave it at that. Is it an even more incomprehensible mess? No.
Well, I don't think it is a mess, because quite frankly, again, it goes back to the main theme, which is that Eoghan Rua's primary purpose is to keep his army together. That's what he will do, and he will do ultimately whatever it takes, make deals with whoever he has to make deals with in order to keep his army together, and that's what he does. So when the Catholics abandon him and begin to attack him, he'll look for help elsewhere. He will, above all else, that Ulster army is his primary concern. That is his great strategic interest. He's not a man who's thinking in national terms. He's not a man who's thinking in European terms. He is a man who's thinking in terms of maintaining and keeping his army together. That is his responsibility, and that's what he'll do. So I don't have any problem with this, by the way, and I don't see that this is something we should ever talk about again. I think it shows that what Eoghan Rua Ó Néill is actually about. That is the reality of the situation.
You should have a box me all and put certain historical facts. Take over and hide.
So it never happened, you know, that is the reality of what's going on. And ultimately, in my view, it doesn't change the picture of Eoghan Rua and what he is and what he ultimately is about. That he is consistent throughout his career, always, and he's got his responsibility to his men, to his forces, to his army, and that ultimately is where he will put all his time and effort.
So we're into his final days now, into late 1649, and he ends up at Clough-Outhar, where he died. I mean, is there a reason why he, like, is it just that's where he couldn't get any further? Like, he was en route to, and he writes a letter sometime before that saying, and going, like, he's en route from, I think from the north down through Cavan, but is it just he gets to there, it's his brother-in-law has Clough-Outhar, so that's where he can stay, and he just can't get any further, and that's where he dies. So is it like
can you think of anywhere better to die,
Yeah.
Brendan? Really, like, in fairness, like, you know what I mean? Obviously, Cavan would be a choice, like, you know what I mean? So, no, I mean, obviously, by this time, the situation has changed yet again, because as we know, Oliver Cromwell arrives over in August 1649 with a huge army, and that changes everything, because now it's clear who the enemy is. You can forget about all your petty squabbles, you can forget about all your infighting. Now the enemy has arrived, and it's very clear. And so, once again, there's a reshuffling of the pack, and Eoghan Rua Ó Néill now finds himself inside the tent rather than outside the tent, and they're coming together to try and cobble together an alliance to oppose Cromwell. So what happens is, of course, you have the siege and the taking of Drogheda, which again sends shockwaves throughout Ireland and indeed throughout Europe with the slaughter that takes place there. And O'Neill now reaches agreement with his former Catholic enemies and the royalists who he's been fighting with, and they're going to join together to oppose Cromwell. And he starts to march south with his army in order to meet up with these allies in order to take on Cromwell. And as you said, Brendan, you know, he's now increasingly in bad health. This guy's been on campaign for, 40, 50 years. He's been on the road. He's been relentlessly campaigning, moving from battlefield to siege to camp to etc. And he's exhausted. The man is just, he is literally just exhausted. And now by late 49 he's actually dying, and he only gets as far as Clough-Outhar and unfortunately dies. And the great question that arises from that, of course, and that's one, as Irish nationalists have always been saying, had he come together with that, would he have taken on Cromwell, and would we have had Eoghan Rua Ó Néill in battle against Oliver Cromwell? The great sort of counterfactual history, what if these men had met together on the battlefields? And of course we can speculate about that, and we might have all different views. In my view, it would never have happened. Eoghan Rua wasn't that stupid. He wouldn't have taken on Oliver Cromwell in a battle. Oliver Cromwell was better supplied, had better weapons, his army was fully paid. Eoghan Rua was no fool. He wasn't going to take on an army like that in open battle. I think he would have moved around, he would have drawn Cromwell into Ireland, he would have weakened him, he would have allowed disease and other factors to weaken the army, and maybe eventually, at his own time, at his own choosing, he may have ended up in battle. But there was going to be, in my view, no great reckoning between these two great characters, if you like, these two great generals, some great one-off battle where it all had been decided. I don't think Eoghan Rua was that type of general, and I don't think it would have happened.
So then, just to kind of sum up Eoghan Rua, I'll ask you both the same question. Why is he important? Is he important? Should we remember him? Should we forget him?
He was very important in the 19th century nationalist memory, and it remains important. He's an example. He does have, beyond survival, he does speak to all of us. He was fighting for a wider Irish cause. Ultimately, he was a figure of national importance. There's a infamous book of his time by a Jesuit called Conor O'Mahony, the Disputatio, which taught that he should have been made crowned King of Ireland. He was the great hope. That importance might have been reflected in the written literature at the time, but in popular memory at that time and subsequently, he's important as somebody who embodies the hope of, if not Irish independence, Irish autonomy. He embodied that, and he was also he was a winner. I mean, if you're looking back on a fairly dismal history of what ifs and defeats, O'Neill was somebody who unambiguously won a battle in the open, not a guerrilla campaign, not sort of hiding behind ditches. This guy stood in the open. So there's something enormously attractive, certainly to the late 19th century, 20th century imagination in that. So he's important both at the time and as a historical figure, and I think Cavan does well to claim him as their own.
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think in some ways we're at times, and I think it's been in the last 30, 40 years, we're kind of almost reluctant to have our heroes or to be looking back at certain times and at certain individuals. And historians feel a need, if you like, to constantly sort of, chip away at our heroes, chip away at these sort of images and say, well, no, it wasn't that straightforward. I don't know if it was much more complicated and there was problems, etc. As if, somebody should be perfect. He was far from perfect. There were many issues around Eoghan Rua Ó Néill, but in terms of his stature and his achievements, they were very considerable, and I think he does deserve a very important place in the Irish story, if you like, and every country, not just Ireland, every country needs people in their past that they can look to, that they can discuss, and that they can, to a certain degree.
And the fact that ultimately he loses is not the point. I mean, our history is a history of losers. I mean, but you have to lose gracefully, or lose with style, or lose but go down fighting. You know what I mean? That's
moral victory.
Well, not just moral victories if you like, but you've actually tried, and he can't be. Sorry, I cut across you there, but just something.
We're a history of losers, and sorry, I don't agree with that, Pádraig. Sorry, I'd be slightly more upbeat than that. We have our losses. I wouldn't call us all losers, but
if you take okay, well, let's not talk about post 22. But I mean, until then, all of the 1916 rising and 7 times in the past 300 years, every time we lost. I mean, that's what I mean by, so you accommodate the history of losing by taking your heroes where you can find them. They don't necessarily, in other words, he's a hero even if he lost. Sometimes a hero is so, especially when he loses, but he's fighting against heavy odds. That's all.
Yeah, but I know, I agree. But ultimately, you could say, well, did he? I mean, he dies. I mean, we're all going to die, unfortunately. But he dies. But I think the manner of his death kind of course, leaves that question open about what might have been, or had he lived, etc. And of course, we don't know, so we can't say that. But in terms of just looking at his life and his achievements or whatever, I think it is a remarkable life. And what's interesting about it as well, it's not just an Irish life; it's a European life. It's one that's lived in Europe. It's one of these sort of connections that Ireland has with Europe that are so important as well. And he was a man who was of European stature as well as one who's important in an Irish context as well. So looking back through the history and looking back through our sort of various ups and downs and what's happened, Eoghan Rua Ó Néill stands out, certainly. He is a figure of huge importance, and as Pádraig says, absolutely at the time, a figure of national importance as well. So I think it's very, very appropriate that he should be remembered, commemorated, but also discussed and debated in terms of what he did and didn't do and his achievements and otherwise. And I think Eoghan Rua himself was a man who, would not have accepted the mantle of sainthood. He was a soldier. He was somebody who was involved in the nitty-gritty of politics. That can be a dirty business, and he, as well as all the others, would have known that as well. But to me, I think it's absolutely wonderful, and it's great that, at this time and at this particular anniversary, that he is being still remembered, still being discussed, and as I said, no better place to do it than in Cavan.
I think that's a very good way to end.
Oh.
Thanks a million, Pádraig and Micheál, because I mean, I've been studying that decade for a long time, and I still can't figure out what's going on sometimes. It's extraordinarily complicated. It really is. And to go through that in about an hour so clearly, I think was just great. We've time, I think, for a couple of questions, if anybody has a question or a comment, and then we'll be going on to Ty.
Could I just ask you about this connection with the O'Reillys? I'm doing a bit of research on Micheál at the moment. We're celebrating 300 years of the town next year. And one of the O'Reillys, Hugh O'Reilly's, apparently supposed to have come back with Eoghan Rua Ó Néill in 1641. But he was later captured and hanged by the Coots. So do you know anything about the O'Reilly connection with O'Neill and when he came back and the transport links between the continent and Ireland?
Well, I think, and Pádraig might know as well, but I think that when Murrah, who's the owner of Clough Castle, or the resident of Clough Castle, was married to, was it Eoghan Rua's sister, I think. So, you know, I mean, again, you know, all of these families are so closely interlinked and connected, like, do you know what I mean? And that O'Reilly connection, because again, as Pádraig is saying, Cavan, effectively, along with parts of Longford, Westmeath, was the heartland of O'Neill when he returned. So those O'Reilly connections were absolutely central, and that support from the O'Reillys was really, really key. And you know, Sir Philip Micheál was again a big supporter and fought in Eoghan Rua's army. So all the key O'Reillys at the time were absolutely part of that effort. I'm not familiar with the particular individual you're talking about, so I don't know, specifically if he came back, but there is no question that O'Reilly connection was absolutely crucial to O'Neill and the success that he had during the 1640s.
Militarily, the O'Reillys, if you look at Benburn, the O'Reillys provided cavalry. So there's no, if I recall correctly, it's cavalry troops, Miles or Mulmurra and Philip Micheál and others. There's no, the regiments, the infantry come from elsewhere. And the question about Coot Hill, was it you say?
Yeah.
And golly, I can't help you there. I mean, isn't it amazing, the Coots, Coot Hill, Coot Hall, Castle Coot, wherever they had their foot. They're very fond of putting their name in places. But anyway, I don't know. Like, I can't help you now. Sorry about that.
I might talk to you.
No, afterwards. In my ear.
John,
Well, I presume when Eoghan Rua came to Cavan, he got a huge army with him. And what happened after he died? What happened to the army? Where did it go? What happened to the people who were fighting with him?
Well, the army had a very sort of, if you like, mixed history after that. None of the regiments went south. And most famously, of course, another of his nephews, Hugh O'Neill, with the Ulster Regiment, were defending Clonmel when Cromwell attacked in May 1650 and inflicted the biggest ever military defeat on Cromwell. That was part of the Ulster Army under Eoghan Rua's nephew that inflicted that defeat on him. Other regiments went into Waterford and other sort of Catholic strongholds in the south, but the main part of the Ulster Army stayed north and went under the command of Eoghan McMahon, the Bishop of Clogher, who was a very close ally of Eoghan Rua, and unfortunately they suffered a catastrophic defeat the following year at Scarfhollis near Letterkenny in Donegal, and were effectively wiped out as an army, as a force. That was the end of it, and Henry, Eoghan Rua's only son, was captured and executed after that battle. So effectively that was the end of the Ulster Army as an army, though elements of it remained in place, and actually one of the last major units of the Catholic forces to surrender was Philip Micheál O'Reilly and his regiment in Cavan, and they were one of the last to surrender in April 1653. So, sort of 3.5 years after the death of Eoghan Rua. So they stay in the fight, they stay in the war in different aspects, but as an army, as a single army, it's effectively destroyed at Scarfhollis in 1650.
Of course, McMahon wasn't a military.
He's a bishop, a diplomat, and a very skilled diplomat and politician, but not a military man.
He's actually appointed, sorry, Pádraig, he's appointed at a council meeting in Belturbet. So that's what happens to him, and then Scarfhollis happens. And
there were two other people. I think there was competition between Henry O'Neill and Phelim O'Neill to be general of Ulster. So Phelim is the guy who was there at the very beginning of the rising. There's no love lost between Phelim and Eoghan Rua. Okay, and it's not all kind of Phelim's fault. Eoghan Rua can be pretty enough too. But there's history as well. Phelim would have belonged to the Queen of the people who sided with back in the 9 Years' War. So Emer or Ever is a compromise candidate, and he does all right. He breaks into that redoubt, that in the Lagan army, Raffo, that area there, and he encamps at a secure location overlooking a ford, and for some strange reason he decides when the enemy comes to come down from the top of the hill and attacked them in the plain, and it didn't work out. And the problem is, for the Ulster Army of Scariff Hollis, I mean, they inflicted heavy casualties. It wasn't a one-sided affair. But when you're beaten, you're so far away from your home base. You're on the wrong side of the Finn and Foyle Valley. You're stuck up there. There's no escape. So the post-battle casualties are catastrophic. Usually you can lose an army, you can lose a battle rather, but you don't lose an army. It retreats, it regroups. Clonus even, to scatter, they regroup, but not after Scariff Hollis. MacMahon himself is caught near Enniskillen, and he's hanged, I think, with the reins of his own horse. Henry O'Neill is beaten to death by a tent pole, by a sergeant beats him to death on Coote's orders, Charles Coote. The same Coote who had been saved by Eoghan Rua at the siege of Derry. So it's a sad story. That answers your question about what happened to the Ulster Army afterwards. Mostly bad. Yeah.
Time for Tommy.
It's a risky thing for me to ask a question. I want to thank you all. It's been brilliant. But, and here's the but, you're talking about the whole thing as if it were a rugby match. Because the people of Ireland suffered terribly, and they seem to be forgotten in the whole thing. I like the way you talk about the crack, or crackadori, or cattle roasters, basically. And some guy wrote about O'Neill's army up in Longford, and they were all over the place like ants. And you have to remember that while these armies were moving up and down, people were suffering. And by the time Eoghan Rua died in 1649, half the people of Ireland were dead at the same time. They had died between 1641 and 1649. Nearly half the people died from one cause or another. It was a bloody disaster for ordinary people. And I think you learned men should always remember the people that suffer on the ground. That's what I
If I could just jump in there, Tommy, and you're quite right. I mean, this is something that I bring up in class an awful lot. There are a certain number of periods in Ireland where you really did not want to be. And one of them was the decade of the famine in the 19th century. One was probably in the early 14th century when the plague was going. And then the other one was that decade, or slightly more, of kind of 1641 up to the early 1650s. It's a horror show. And I mean, there's there's deportations, there's plague. Like, I remember Micheál, if anyone's interested in the Cromwellian thing, Micheál made a great documentary when your book came out, the God's Executioner, and you often see it still on the History Channel and stuff. And I use it oftentimes if I'm teaching Cromwell. I just sit back and let Micheál do the hard work. I might just sit back in the room. But Pádraig was also in that and made the point, I think, as well, that, you know, that I don't know what the population death is. I don't know if it's as much as 50%, I could be wrong. But it's a horror show. And when you have how many armies marauding around Ireland and bringing with them disease and bringing with them, you know, raiding and all these different things, you know, as you say quite rightly, Tommy, it's the poor people, the regular people, who are the ultimate losers and all that. And you have the same thing on the continent as well. You know, during the 17th century, you said, you know, there's 3 years, there's not fighting. I mean,
I totally take your point, and you know, war is an ugly business. Whoever's fighting, and it's often the civilians, the non-combatants who really suffer in that. But just a slight sort of clarification: the real disaster comes in the next 4 years after Eoghan Rua's death. It's the period 49 to 53 that is the absolutely catastrophic period demographically. That's when the Irish population falls. We don't know, maybe between 20 and 30%. From warfare, starvation, Black Death, you know, all these things. It is absolutely horrific. In fact, worse proportionally than the Great Famine of the mid-19th century, which traditionally is seen as, you know, the worst period of Irish history. So, I mean, it is absolutely disastrous. There's no way around it. What always amazes me, however, is, and this is not in any way to minimise or to excuse or justify, is how quickly the Irish population recovers. And by the 1670s, the Irish population has exceeded its pre-war population. It is absolutely extraordinary. Do you know what I mean? It is growing now. Pádraig, we can discuss this offline with the exact timing of it. But the recovery period for Ireland is really amazing. I've never seen, you expect the country to be on its knees for a century or more. In different ways it may be, but actually the people of Ireland seem to be remarkably resilient in terms of comeback. But that doesn't in any way take away from, as Brendan is saying, if there was one 4-year period you did not want to be in Ireland, it was 49 to 53. That was in my opinion, most catastrophic. So all what we're talking about is taking place in the context of that. So you're absolutely right to point it out.
And as you see, the problem with describing military history is that, and you use the word, you're talking about as if we're talking about pawns on a chessboard, or there's some analogy you use, and we're talking about in a very impersonal sort of a way, which you kind of have to, if you're talking about, if you're to convey what you're talking about, while being aware. I'd even go or move further, and I don't think they recovered. They were back to 1641 population levels by the next time of the next war. And they're never, I don't think they're hitting 1641 population levels till the 1760s, till the latter part. It's that, but we don't, we differ because I'm Chancellor. I tried to do this, write about that, capture this, and looking back on it, I'm not too happy with my methodology, looking back on it, but I reckon it's around a quarter of the population, but others say that's an underestimate. But it's, again, we're quantifying, and we're not trying to capture human experience, which is inevitable.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more, if anybody has anything else to say.
Could I just ask, where is Eoghan Rua Ó Néill?
Oh God.
I think that's tomorrow's trip. I think tomorrow's trip is going to be...
Ask an archaeologist.
Yeah. That's going to be the big reveal tomorrow.
The traditional place is in the Abbey just down the way. Some people say he may have been buried on Trinity Island, which was a pre-Mastertensian community, not in the Clough area. We don't know ultimately. My general feeling is that he would be down there just for, it was a Franciscan place, he would have been a patron, the O'Reillys, he would have been seen as an O'Reilly. He's probably buried, I was asking Coleman O'Clobby, because they're doing work down there at the moment, and there was all this talk, can we find Eoghan Rua's body and all this, and things. But anyway, I was asking Coleman, where would he be buried if he was buried down there? And Coleman reckoned the patrons of Franciscan Place were buried up at the right-hand side near the altar, in a prominent position. So if you found the outline of the church, then you'll know where the altar is, and then in that general area is probably where he's buried. Now, we don't know, but
I think it's good because Eoghan Rua had very close association with Franciscans and was very allied to them. So Flaherty O'Mara was one of his great, who was the Archbishop of Tuam and a Franciscan, was one of his great patrons. So it would, I think, make absolute sense, Brendan.
Even in terms of Catholic thinking, if you're buried in a prominent position down there, which is the town church, that was what was used. That people will see you, remember you, say a prayer for you, all that kind of thing. You're stuck out in Trinity Island, you're not going to be seen or thought of or prayed for as much as if you're in there. So if I were him, I'd want to be in there. Anyway, look folks, thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up that one and then we're going to get tied up now. So we'll just have a little turnaround. But if you can please just show your appreciation for 2 days.